The air inside the Copper Kettle on the outskirts of Fort Wallace was a stagnant soup of stale cigar smoke, spilled rye, and a faint, metallic tang that no scrubbing could ever erase. It was November 14, 1891, a Saturday, which meant the high-stakes game was in session. Under the single, humming electric bulb, the scene was a perfect tableau of Western routine. Four men sat around the small, polished mahogany table, their expressions fixed in the rigid masks of intense concentration only Texas Hold'em could produce. There was Thomas Thorne, known universally as the banker, a sharp man in a starched shirt and waistcoat who never seemed to sweat, even when the pot was large enough to buy the saloon outright. He didn't gamble for thrill, but for meticulous profit, his pile of chips already intimidatingly high. Across from him was Robert Caldwell, a rancher whose hands were permanently calloused and whose brow was permanently furrowed. Caldwell played with a frantic desperation, as if every hand was a last-ditch attempt to save his farm from the relentless grip of a looming drought. His stack was meager, reflecting his luck over the past few months. To Thorne's left sat Arthur Finch, the quietest of the group. Finch ran the local livery and was respected, if rarely understood. He was a steady player, neither reckless nor timid, but tonight, his usual composure seemed to be fraying, evidenced by the nervous twitch near his left eye. He had much to lose, and his gaze was fixed on the chips like a drowning man on a distant shore. And then there was Silas. Silas wasn't a player. He was the bartender, a tall, thin man who moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a clock ticking toward midnight. He polished glasses behind the long wooden counter, his presence a silent, omnipresent fixture. He knew the ebb and flow of this weekly ritual, the boasts, the curses, the inevitable end when the losers slunk out into the cold night. Tonight, however, the routine felt different. The light seemed dimmer, the silence between hands heavier, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The stakes, purely in gold and paper, were already the highest Silas had ever seen, but he sensed a more profound currency was about to be exchanged. The creak of the door hinges, a sound usually ignored, cut through the saloon's quiet drone like a snapped wire. Every head, including Silas's behind the bar, lifted to watch the entrance. The man who entered was a walking anomaly in Fort Wallace. He wasn't rugged like Caldwell, nor sharply tailored like Thorne, yet his clothes were dark, impeccable, and seemed to absorb the light. He carried no saddlebags, no rifle, and wore no dust. This was Elias Vane. Vane was not tall, but his presence seemed to occupy an unnatural amount of space. His most striking feature was his face, pale and unlined, suggesting an age impossible to determine. But it was his eyes that drew, and held, the gaze. Dark, steady, and utterly devoid of the casual flicker or nervousness common to men about to join a high-stakes game. They were still, like water at the bottom of a well. He walked with an almost silent step straight toward the poker table. Thorne, the self-appointed gatekeeper of the game, frowned slightly, a rare break in his discipline. "Evening," Thorne acknowledged, his voice dry. "Table's full, mister." Vane offered no greeting, no smile, and no apology. He simply rested his hands, palms down, on the back of a fifth chair that always remained unused, dedicated to holding discarded coats. The sheer stillness of his posture was a challenge. "I believe," Vane said, his voice low and smooth, like polished stone, "there is always room for a man with the means to play the stakes required." He didn't look at the money, but at the four men, his gaze lingering longest on Finch and the desperate Caldwell. Thorne, intrigued and annoyed in equal measure, gestured sharply. "Sit, then. But you play our rules, and you buy in high. Very high." Vane pulled out the chair and took his seat. Without another word, he placed a small, dark leather valise on the table and flipped it open. Inside, stacked neatly, were not coin rolls or rough currency, but gold certificates and $20 double eagles, a sum that made the gold already on the table look like pocket change. It was an instant, silent confirmation of the unsettling tension he had brought into the Copper Kettle. Elias Vane bought in. The sum he placed on the table was so substantial it silenced the murmurs that had begun to rise from the other patrons. It wasn't just money, it was a brazen, wordless declaration of financial impunity. The mood of the poker game shifted instantly from familiar rivalry to cold, hard calculation. The first few hands Vane played were conservative, almost tedious. He folded often, observing the others with those unsettlingly dark eyes, learning their tells and habits. Thorne, the banker, tried to push him, raising aggressively on strong hands, but Vane met the challenge with only small measured calls, never giving up a read. Then, Vane's strategy changed. He began to play hands that defied the odds. A pair of sevens beating Thorne's aces, a weak queen-high suddenly filling to a straight on the river. His wins were silent, delivered with the same unnerving calm as his folds. The chips vanished from Caldwell's and Finch's stacks at an alarming rate, only to be consolidated into Vane's neat, towering pile. Soon, the chips were irrelevant. Vane swept them aside and pointed at the gold and currency that had been pushed to the center. "Gentlemen," he murmured, his voice cutting through the tension, "let us dispense with the tokens. The stakes of this game are now represented solely by what you can afford to lose. The real cost." Thorne, caught in the lure of Vane's incredible luck, readily agreed, as did a desperate Caldwell and a pale Finch. As the hour grew late, the money on the table swelled to an unbelievable fortune. Caldwell, having lost his own funds, had begun to gamble his farm's deed. Finch was playing with the collateral of his livery business. And Thorne, with a grim determination, was quietly dipping into his bank's reserves, money that did not belong to him. The deeper the men sank into debt, the less they spoke, only the soft flick of the cards and the clink of gold marking the passage of time toward an inevitable, and potentially ruinous, conclusion. Robert Caldwell was losing his composure, a slow, agonizing slide visible only to Silas and the silent Elias Vane. The rancher's forehead was beaded with sweat despite the cool November air. He wasn't just losing his money, he was losing the last line of defense for his wife and children. He had already bet the deed to the farm. Now, he was playing on credit, a promise Vane had accepted with a mere nod. Caldwell reached instinctively for his gold pocket watch, a cherished heirloom, its case engraved with his father's initials. It was a habit, a ritualistic check to ensure time was still moving, that the outside world still existed. The watch had never failed him, its rhythmic tick a reliable anchor in the chaos of life. He flipped open the cover. The brass hands were frozen. 11:47 p.m. A sudden sharp chill swept through the room, making a few of the men near the bar pull their jackets tighter. Caldwell stared at the inert hands. He shook the watch violently, then held it to his ear. Silence. The watch, which had kept perfect time for 50 years, had stopped dead. Caldwell's heart hammered against his ribs. It was a terrifying, nonsensical omen. He looked up, his panic momentarily eclipsing his financial despair. Vane was looking back at him, not with pity or triumph, but with a gaze that seemed to acknowledge the cessation of time itself. "Sir." Vane's voice was barely a whisper as he gathered the deck. "Your concern seems to be elsewhere. Do you call, or do you fold? We have a final hand yet to play." The pressure of the moment, the immense pile of gold, and the unnerving realization that his personal connection to linear time had just snapped, forced Caldwell to act. He pushed his remaining few chips, representing his last, frantic hope, into the center. He had no choice but to see what ruin Vane had dealt him. The rancher placed the broken watch back into his waistcoat, but the silence where the ticking should have been was deafening. Elias Vane's slender fingers picked up the deck of cards. He shuffled them with a grace that seemed out of place in the dusty saloon. The soft zip of the paper stalked the only sound in a room full of held breath. He was the dealer for this final, defining hand, and a profound stillness had fallen over the table. Thorne, the banker, usually unreadable, was sweating lightly above his collar. He had everything riding on this, not just his own reputation, but the financial health of the community bank he managed. He saw Vane's eyes on him, and felt not judgment, but a cold, predatory certainty. Vane began to deal. One card, face down, to each of the 4 players, starting with Thorne. The silence was absolute. Even the men at the bar seemed to have paused their drinks mid-air, sensing the monumental weight of the moment. The second card was dealt, and then the third, until each man held his 2 hidden whole cards. Vane then presented the 3 communal cards, the flop, to the center of the table. A high pair, 2 tens, and an offsuit jack. A decent but dangerous start. Finch and Caldwell were trembling slightly, their hands hovering over their cards like they were touching fire. Their final hope lay beneath their fingertips. Finch glanced at the growing stack of Vane's money, a fortune that could change the future of Fort Wallace, or condemn 4 men to ruin. Vane then dealt the 4th communal card, the turn. It was a queen. The possibilities for a straight, or a full house, suddenly exploded. The tension became almost physical, a crushing weight in the air. "The river," Vane announced, his voice devoid of inflection. He slid the 5th and final card onto the table. It was the king of spades. The table was set, 10, 10, jack, queen, king. The community cards offered a potential straight flush for anyone holding an ace and a specific 10 value card, or a high straight for those who paired the 9. The fate of 4 men, their livelihoods, and their reputations rested on the 2 small cards they held in their hands, cards now dwarfed by the immense and frightening pile of gold at the center of the table. Vane simply sat back, waiting for the bids, his eyes burning with an unsettling, anticipatory calm. The silence around the poker table was so complete, so demanding, that it felt like a fragile glass about to shatter. The other patrons in the Copper Kettle were merely shadows and background noise, their conversations subdued out of respect, or perhaps fear, of the wealth gathered at the center table. Silas, the bartender, was meticulously wiping down the counter for the 10th time. He was watching the players peripherally, a silent spectator to the ruin unfolding. He saw Thorne's grin set to his jaw, Finch's trembling fingers near his cards, and Caldwell's panicked breathing. And he saw Elias Vane, who hadn't moved a muscle since dealing the king of spades, his expression patiently expectant. Then came the sound that would forever divide that night into before and after. "Bartender, fill this glass, and be quick about it." The voice belonged to a heavily inebriated prospector named Old Man Hemlock, who had been nursing a single glass of rotgut whiskey for hours. It was an unnecessary, loud command, a break in the respectful silence. Silas, moving purely on muscle memory, put down his cloth. He glanced one last time at the poker table. The 4 men were perfectly still, leaning slightly forward, their eyes riveted to their hidden cards. The moment was frozen, for competitors staring at their final, ultimate decision. Silas took exactly 30 seconds to walk to the end of the bar, pour a double shot for Hemlock, and collect the coin. The minor errand provided the absolute, necessary gap. It was a mundane act of service, yet it was the only piece of genuine human interaction that evening. As Silas turned back, the sound of the prospector's slurred "thank you" still echoing slightly, he paused. His eyes moved back to the center of the room, expecting to see a hand played, a winner declared, a fight starting. Instead, a different, colder silence greeted him. It was a silence that meant not tension, but absence. Silas stopped dead in his tracks, the wet glass still clutched in his hand. The silence that now permeated the Copper Kettle was absolute, cold, and entirely unnatural. It wasn't the silence of concentration, but the heavy, leaden silence of a vacuum. He walked slowly back toward the center table, a knot of icy dread tightening in his stomach. His eyes scanned the familiar setting, trying to process what was wrong. The single dangling light bulb hummed faintly above the scene, illuminating the finality of the tableau. The table was undisturbed. The scattered cards, 5 on the community pile, 2 in front of each invisible player, were exactly as Vane had dealt them. The immense pile of gold and currency, the accumulated wealth of the region, sat untouched, gleaming under the harsh light. But the chairs. The 4 chairs were pulled out from the table, positioned exactly where the men had been sitting barely 30 seconds before. Yet, they were empty. Thorne, Caldwell, Finch, and Vane were gone. Silas blinked, convinced the smoke or the late hour was playing tricks on his mind. He turned his head sharply, sweeping the room. No one was at the bar to his left. The back exit was closed. The patrons who had been near the back wall were now staring with bewildered, drunken incomprehension at the empty table. There was no sound of a door slamming, no scuffle, no cry of anger or pain. It was as if the four men had simply, universally, decided to rise and step out of existence at the very same microsecond. Silas dropped the glass. It hit the wooden floor with a dull, muffled thud that sounded impossibly loud in the dead quiet of the saloon. He walked to Caldwell's empty chair and reached out a hand, half expecting to feel the residual warmth of the man's body. There was none. Only the chilling realization that in the small, insignificant space of time it took to pour a drink, the poker game had concluded in an impossible fashion. The men had never left the table. The table was simply empty. The first person to approach the table was Silas, his movements slow and reverent, like walking into a crime scene that defied physics. He instinctively looked at the cards. The stakes were still arrayed exactly as they had been at the height of the tension, a glittering, obscene mound of gold pieces and folded paper money. The fact that the money was untouched was the single most confounding detail. This was Fort Wallace, not a monastery. If the men had rushed out for a sudden brawl, the gold would have been scooped up. If it had been a robbery, the gold would be gone, and the men would likely be bleeding. But nothing was disturbed. Silas reached down and carefully picked up the cards belonging to Elias Vane. Vane, the newcomer, the silent catalyst for this night of ruin. The cards in Vane's hand were the ace, king, queen, jack, and 10 of spades. A royal flush. The perfect, unbeatable hand. It was the hand that had won the pot. Vane had triumphed. The gold, the fortunes, the farm deeds, the banker's reserves, all belonged to him. Yet, he hadn't reached for it. He hadn't even had the chance to announce his win. The gold sat mocking the silence, a reward for a winner who had no intention of claiming it. Silas placed the cards back down, his hand trembling. He then looked at the hands of the other 3 men. Thorne, the banker, held a good but ultimately losing full house. Caldwell had a pair of aces, insufficient against the high board and the royal flush. Finch's hand was worthless. The logical conclusion was inescapable. The game was over. Vane had won. His opponents were ruined. The game was settled. But why leave the prize? And how? The cards were still scattered in front of their empty places, but the men themselves were simply cancelled. The only thing more disturbing than the disappearance was the chilling, clinical perfection of the scene they had abandoned. It was not a hasty exit. It was a final resolution. Sheriff Dalton arrived an hour later, a man accustomed to drunken brawls and petty theft, not vanishing acts. His initial confusion quickly hardened into disbelief, then professional frustration. He interviewed the patrons, but their testimonies were useless, a blur of whiskey and contradicting claims. All agreed on the silent, instantaneous nature of the disappearance. The sheriff turned his attention back to the table, searching for the tangible clue that would ground this phantom event in reality. He examined the abandoned possessions. Caldwell's broken pocket watch. Thorne's expensive spectacles. Tucked tightly into the lining of Arthur Finch's empty waistcoat, the one that still hung neatly on the back of his chair, Dalton found it, a small, faded tintype photograph. It was a picture of the 4 poker players, Thorne, Caldwell, Finch, and Elias Vane, posed around that very table. The image was clearly recent, judging by the clothes and the single electric light fixture above them. This wasn't a nostalgic portrait, it must have been taken within the last few hours. Yet, the composition was horribly wrong. In the photo, the men weren't engaged in the game. They weren't smiling, or even concentrating. They were looking directly at the camera with an expression that Dalton couldn't reconcile, a look of deep, profound, and unanimous resignation. It was the look of men who had just accepted a fate they could not fight, a look that conveyed terrified finality. More disturbing still, Vane was present and accounted for in the photograph. This confirmed that the picture was taken after he joined the game. But why take a grim, final portrait in the middle of a high-stakes match? And who had been holding the camera? The camera itself was nowhere in the saloon. Sheriff Dalton held the tintype up to the light, the faint sepia tone of the image adding a layer of age and inevitability to the unsettling scene. The photo was not proof of their escape, It looked chillingly like a farewell portrait taken just moments before they ceased to be. Sheriff Dalton, having dismissed the fantastical theories of teleportation or demonic intervention, began the grim, methodical process of a factual investigation. He treated the scene as he would any disappearance, as a potential kidnapping or a coordinated flight. Yet, every avenue he explored led to a dead end that only amplified the impossibility of the event. First, the exits were examined. The front door of the Copper Kettle was solid oak, the latch heavy. The back service door, near Silas's storage area, was latched from the inside. There were no tunnels, no trapdoors, and the saloon sat on a stone foundation that showed no sign of having been recently disturbed. Next, he questioned the remaining patrons, holding them until dawn. Their stories were confusing only because they were consistent. They heard nothing. No scuffle, no raised voices, no running footsteps. A miner swore he had his back to the bar for only a minute, and when he turned around, the four men were simply not there. The vanishing had occurred in a pocket of absolute silence, witnessed by dozens who saw nothing. Dalton took precise measurements. The distance from the poker table to the front door was 25 feet. To the back door, 18. For four men to silently coordinate an exit without disturbing the gold, without opening a door loud enough to alert the dozen other men, and without leaving a single trace of motion, was simply not possible. The sheriff inspected the chairs again. They were pulled out, as if the men had risen swiftly and simultaneously. But why? And where had they gone? His final assessment, scribbled in his notebook before the sun rose, was damning in its simplicity. The four men, Thorne, Caldwell, Finch and Vane, had left behind a colossal amount of money, several vital personal effects, and no physical evidence of an exit. It was a case that defied the practical reality of Fort Wallace. The law had nothing to pursue because, according to every sign, the four men had never actually left the confines of the saloon. The investigation stalled almost immediately. With no bodies and no forced entry, the official report drifted toward flight from debt, a common, if unsatisfying, conclusion in the West. But the untouched gold and the eerie silence of the event troubled Sheriff Dalton enough to send a wire to a few neighboring territories, inquiring about a man named Elias Vane. The answers that trickled back were fragmented, vague, and deeply unsettling. Vane was not known to be a criminal, but a harbinger. A clerk in Pueblo, Colorado, recalled a Vane who had appeared briefly in 1888, just before a massive and unexplained livestock blight ruined the majority of the local ranchers. He had joined a single, high-stakes game of faro. After the game, the winner, a man who had bet his entire future, was found catatonic in the alley, his money intact, mumbling only about a settled debt. Another report, from a struggling mining town in Nevada 2 years prior, mentioned a mysterious investor named Vane who arrived during a time of extreme collective hardship. He had proposed a strange business agreement to the town council, one that involved securing their entire collective future against a single, unnamed, guarantee. The council declined. Within a month, the mine collapsed, sealing the town's fate. Vane was never seen again. The details were never consistent enough to confirm identity, but the pattern was chillingly clear. Elias Vane did not seek money, he sought stakes. He seemed to appear precisely when a small community, or its representative men like Thorne and Caldwell, were burdened by an immense, almost spiritual, debt or despair. It was rumored that Vane never took his winnings in cash. He took something else, a price exacted for the chance to play for ultimate redemption or ultimate ruin. The men of Fort Wallace were not simply robbed, they had entered into a devastating final contract with a figure who played a much older, darker game than poker. Weeks bled into months, but the mystery surrounding the four empty chairs never dissipated. For Silas, the bartender, the memory of the men's sudden absence did not fade. It hardened into a terrifying, immovable fixture. Sheriff Dalton had officially closed the case, listing the men as missing persons, but for Silas, they were never truly gone. He refused to move the four mahogany chairs. They remained pulled out from the table, precisely where the men had risen. The poker table itself, reclaimed after 3 days of sitting untouched with its immense, glittering haul of gold, became an unofficial, dreadful memorial. Silas would clean every other inch of the copper kettle with his usual meticulousness, but he always avoided the center table. The area felt different. It was inexplicably colder, even when the coal stove on the far wall was roaring. The light bulb above it seemed to flicker with an agonizing frequency, and the silence that settled there was always absolute, never broken by the background noise of the saloon. It wasn't just an empty space, it was a perfect vacuum of human presence. Silas began to perceive the four men not as disappeared, but as frozen. He felt the perpetual, crushing tension of that final hand preserved in the very air above the wood. He imagined them still sitting there, spectral figures holding their cards, their eyes fixed on a future that could never arrive, unable to collect their winnings or escape their ruin. One late evening, while mopping the floor, Silas passed too close. A sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion washed over him, a composite of the desperate panic of Caldwell, the cold, calculating dread of Thorne, and the unsettling, quiet certainty of Vane. He heard no voices, but he felt the immense, agonizing energy of four souls locked into a single, devastating, frozen moment in time. The empty chairs were not a sign of an exit, they were proof that the game had been eternalized, a chilling, silent monument to a debt that could never be settled. Of the four men who vanished, Thomas Thorne, the banker, left behind the most immediate and devastating ruin. The gold and currency Vane won were not merely Thorne's personal fortune, they were the stability of Fort Wallace itself. Thorne, in his relentless pursuit of profit and his arrogant belief in his own skill, had been playing with the bank's reserves, gambling the deposits of nearly every family and business in town. The day after the disappearance, the town discovered the truth. Thorne hadn't just lost a poker game, he had orchestrated a secret, calculated heist against his own community, using the poker table as his personal, catastrophic ledger. The weight of the gold left behind was enormous, but the legal and moral liability was immeasurable. Sheriff Dalton soon learned that the stakes Thorne played were far more than just money. Thorne was deeply indebted to external predatory investors in the East, men who had given him only a week to secure an astronomical sum, or face financial ruin and jail. Thorne had seen Vane's arrival not as a threat, but as a final, desperate opportunity to win enough to cover his enormous and complex liabilities. This debt was the true currency of the final hand. Elias Vane, it seemed, wasn't interested in the gold itself. He was interested in the magnitude of the obligation. Thorne had walked into the Copper Kettle that night carrying not just his cards, but the entire, catastrophic weight of his betrayal and financial ruin. His ultimate loss was not the royal flush, but the fact that Vane accepted a stake far beyond the limits of mere cash. Vane had taken the debt itself, the moral and financial future of Thorne and the men he ruined, and by winning, had relieved Thorne of it in the most final, terrifying way possible. The banker didn't flee his obligations, he simply had the contract fulfilled in a currency no court could trace. The poker table was scrubbed clean days after the disappearance, the gold removed, and the cards swept up. Yet, as the weeks passed, a quiet, horrifying detail began to emerge, visible only to those who spent hours in the eerie stillness of the Copper Kettle, specifically, Silas. The dust. Fort Wallace was a dusty town. Every surface, no matter how often wiped, accumulated a fine, reddish-brown layer of silt within days. The poker table was no exception. However, Silas noticed a specific anomaly in the dust pattern around Elias Vane's chair. He ran his finger along the wood. The area where Thorne sat, where Caldwell sat, and where Finch sat, all showed the inevitable accumulation of fine powder. But in the small, semicircular space immediately to the right of Vane's now empty chair, the wood was perfectly, unnaturally clean. It was a clear, crescent-shaped absence in the dust, the exact size and shape of a man's hand resting on the table, poised to rake in the chips. The chilling conclusion was that Vane's hand had remained there, unmoved, long after the rest of his body had ceased to be visible. The dust had settled around it, only to be disturbed later, perhaps by the removal of the gold, revealing the clean, ghost-like outline. Silas realized that the disappearance wasn't just instantaneous, it was selective. The four men hadn't been swept away. They had been removed from their forms, with certain parts or certain moments left behind. The pocket watch, frozen at 11:47 p.m. The photograph, showing their final, resigned faces. And now, the perfect hand-shaped absence on the table, a chilling imprint of the winner who stayed just long enough to ensure his victory was recorded in the physical world. It was the mark of a player who had completed his devastating transaction before vanishing. The year 1891 passed, giving way to 1892, but the memory of the four men, Thorne, Caldwell, Finch and Vane, remained the defining feature of Fort Wallace. The Copper Kettle never closed, but it became a different sort of place. It was no longer a saloon, it was a museum of the inexplicable, a monument to a contract that went terribly wrong. Silas, the bartender, bought the establishment using a small, inherited sum and a loan from a bank in the next county. His first act as owner was to permanently mount the 4 chairs to the floor, exactly where they stood on the night of November 14th. The table, despite its painful history, was polished daily, the unmoved hand outline often faintly visible if the light caught the dust just right. Patrons still came, but they rarely sat near the center table. They drank quickly, spoke in hushed tones, and kept their eyes averted. The consensus was that the men hadn't just vanished. They had been reclaimed. Thorne, Caldwell, and Finch had lost everything, their money, their deeds, and their lives, to a debt so profound it required a metaphysical forfeit. And Elias Vane? He was the winner who took nothing physical but everything essential. He won the royal flush, thereby finalizing the transaction and proving his absolute authority over the stakes. He had simply stepped out of the physical world because his work was done. The final, terrifying truth, recognized by Silas as he watched the empty chairs every night, was this: the disappearance was not an event of motion, but of stasis. The 4 men were not missing, they were simply removed from time itself, forever locked in the moment of Vane's final, devastating victory. The gold remained because the stakes were never the money. The chairs remained because the men had indeed never left. They were still there, paying the price of the final hand in a silent, endless game that required perpetual payment. The kettle, therefore, could never truly close, standing open as the grim, eternal witness to a high-stakes game that finally paid out in human souls.